So I want to start with a very simple question, and in a way all the keynotes have said similar things, and it's good to be in an audience where you don't need to explain too much. But what is a street? Trying to find an answer was more difficult than I thought. I had to rummage around many books. And I think it tells you a bit about the complex character of the street. So most famously, Jane Jacobs argued that think of a city and what comes to mind, it's streets. David Crouch in the 1990s said the street is a series, a fragmented and uneven series of bits. Each is a side of something else, of someone else, of somewhere else. And lastly, more recently, Tonkis defined the street as the simplest form of public space in the city, yet more complex than it looks. So I think what we can gather from all these different definitions, and there are more, is that the street is a complex social space in which the private and imagined worlds of its dwellers or residents overlap with the public, political, economic, and social structures of society. So it's a place where very different dimensions overlap. And like I said, the keynotes today really pointed that out. It's a physical environment, it's a temporal environment, it's a social environment, but also a political policy environment, a human and more than human environment, a technological environment. So how can we make sense of that? For a long time, there has been a tendency in urban studies to examine only one particular layer, one of these. And despite the impetus to study the city as a complex entity, the specialized disciplinary nature in our world in academia has led to research particular dimensions of urban life and ignoring others. So as Ashamin explains, there's a tendency to do this kind of dualism, form of dualism with the street, private, public, individual, community, local, global, which while it's important, and we need to do some of that to research, it tends to sap out the vibrancy and the lived qualities of place. And Ashamin elaborates this in a very recent paper. Briefly, I want to read out because I think it really says something about the complexity and liveliness of the street. The world is to be surrounded by so much that might turn out to be formative. The mingling with the public and the commercial with the non-commercial, the rub of humans, technologies, buildings, infrastructures, animals, and nature, the many human acts of praying, lingering, passing through, watching and listening, the amplification of intersecting bodies, objects, matters, symbols, smells and sounds, the rhythms set by callers, clocks, codes, timetables, technologies, and official and unofficial guardians of our public space, and the asynchrony of repetition, emergence, and novelty following from the latter impulses and combinations. The busy street or mall presents a space of multiple happenings, influences from near and afar, continuous ebb and flow, more than human resonances. So this kind of dialogical or relational view of place was introduced firstly, I guess, by Doreen Massey in the 1990s, where she understands place as this kind of meeting place, the location of the intersection of particular bundles and of activity spaces, of connections and interrelations, of influences and movements. This was then followed by Ashen Amin's groundbreaking book, Cities, Reimagining the Urban, in 2002, which firmly established an approach to cities and its streets in relational terms as topologies of many intersecting entities, networks and flows whose combined forces shape urban development. And such relational thinking has led to a great interest in understanding how these intersecting bodies, entities, and forces combine to this constantly changing and lived place we've heard a lot about today already. So most notably, this can be found in the work of actor network influence studies. However, I think there's also been a tendency in this work to ignore human subjectivity. So the initial seeds of this relational thinking, in academics always like to think they were the first to think about, don't quote me. Yeah. Okay. So the initial seeds of this relational thinking were established by people, I think, like Walter Benjamin, Simmel, Georg Simmel, who similarly were trying to understand how broader political, economic, technological, and cultural changes were impacting on the ways individuals felt the city. And what unites these two writers, for me, is their interest in trying to understand how and why, at a particular time in history, a unique street character emerges. In other words, how global structural changes are reflected in the everyday material arrangement of a streetscape, and how individual practices and sensory emotional experiences of this streetscape create this particular feel of place, which, more recently have been theorized with the trendy word of atmosphere or ambience. So what are atmospheres? Atmosphere refers, according to Böhme, the German philosopher, to the emotional tinge of space that is produced through the correlation of practices, buildings, policies that create the character, atmosphere, that's fun, that create the character of an atmosphere. But at the same time, atmospheres are something entirely subjective. In order to say what they are, or better, to define their character, one must expose oneself to them. One must experience them in terms of one's own emotional state. Without a sentient subject, they are nothing. So for me, atmosphere brings subjectivity back into the picture, which I think is quite important. So as Böhme further elaborates, atmospheres are between subjects and objects, are floating in between, something between things and the perceiving subjects. However, they are not and shouldn't be conceived as free-floating energies. But they are sensory attributes that proceed from and are created by things, persons and their constellations. And, if we think of them as sensory attributes, then we can pin them down. And that's where I'm coming from. So in my work, I've argued that to research the street, we need to pay attention to what can be broadly termed the urban sensorium. We experience the city first and foremost as a corporeal space, whether we're directly engaging with urban life in situ or even mapping it via digital means in an architectural studio or looking at some place apps. We feel and interpret the urban landscape through our bodies sensorially. Perceptions of places are mapped through sensory experiences. How a city looks and feels and how its spaces are organized forms a material base upon which a range of possible sensations and social practices can be thought about, evaluated, and achieved. And surprise, surprise, this is a quote from David Harvey from the 1990s. Yeah, so he already pointed out the importance of sensation long before all these new debates have emerged in the last 10 years. So conceiving atmospheres as a sensory spatial experience where the personal subjective realm and the broader structural realm conflate helps us to make it possible to create a research object. Indeed, a focus on the senses helps us to ground the elusive notion of atmosphere. And Böhme suggests that we need to approach atmospheres from two sides. The production side, or what he calls the production aesthetics, and from the reception side, the reception aesthetics. And I will divide my research into these two categories for the sake of proving him today. So why am I showing these pictures? I suddenly realized that I'm talking about a lot of cities, but I didn't have any pictures of Barcelona, so I put them in now. So my initial research was looking at the regeneration of two marginal neighborhoods in Barcelona and in Manchester, and I argued that the sensory dimension played a crucial role in framing the urban regeneration in both places. And as you know, everything starts with for a personal reason why you choose cities. I mean, people don't mention that, but usually, you have some subjective interest in your research topic. And happily, and luckily, it turned out that the area I focused on, Castlefield, wanted to be the Catalan area of Manchester. There's even a Catalan square and a bar called Barça there. So I was really lucky with all that. And what I wanted to show in my initial in my PhD research is to illustrate how people create their city, not only through their daily uses and memories, but also through their sensory engagements, and how important sensory engagements are in creating place attachments. I also simultaneously examined how the physical urban environment, as it was changing, it was spatialized and materialized through sensory presences and sensory absences. And it was very interesting to analyze what is put in or kept out when regeneration happens. So examining regeneration through a sensory prism revealed how sensory order and experience is a political, social, historical, and even economic matter. So power relations in the street are embedded in, exercised, and resisted through the sensuous geography of place. And Sophie pointed that out. I think that political aspect is very important to keep always in mind when researching the sensory. But how can we research something as elusive as the senses? And despite of what House has termed a sensorial revolution since the start of the new century, the sensory has been very slow to filter into the methodological consciousness of researchers, as Mason and Davis remind us. So in this first project, Castlefield and Raval comparison, I really tried to point out I used two key methods to research the sensory. On the one hand, I studied other people's systems of sensory classification and categorization, but also me, myself, as a researcher, I used my own body as a self-reflecting and experiencing body. So I created a sensory characterization of urban change through evocative interviews with users of space, from tourists, locals, migrants, etc., but also by interviewing or setting similar questions to architects, councillors, politicians in both areas. And I also then used my own body, a classical ethnography, which I called participant walking or something like that, to research how the sensory landscape was changing. Since then, I've elaborated on these methods, and I want to spend the last 10 minutes talking a bit more about what I've been doing more lately. So during my most recent research last 2 years, I did a research project with Gillian Rose where we examined how affective atmospheres are constructed through digital visualization technologies in architectural studios. So over the past decade, digital visualization technologies have expanded rapidly in architecture studios. They all work with them nowadays. And at the same time, both architecture as a professional practice, but also academia has increasingly become interested in this notion of atmosphere. And while atmosphere was before only relegated to some phenomenological books, but now it's really entered, that term has entered architectural mainstream and design mainstream. And you need to see that in the context of the experience economy of selling cities, selling public space. So architecture is increasingly judged by its ability to transform the sensation of the subject. And computer-generated images, CGIs, are key to that process. So what did we actually do there then? How did we find out how these atmospheres are constructed? And I just want to show you how they are constructed. So this is a functional picture of an area in Qatar. We've ended up in Qatar, luckily, not by chance again. And then that's the visualization that gets sold to the client and created through layers of color, etc., through by the atmospheres. And thank God they use the word again and again. Yeah. So what we did was, first of all, a workplace ethnography in architectural practices. And for the first time, I really thought, you know, I'm so happy to be an academic. I realized architecture, for all its glamour, by now has become a job where people click the mouse all day long. And it made us aware of the trained architectural body versus our academic bodies. Dealing with technology, their careful color differentiation, you know, to the untrained eye, it all looks the same to me, but they are very different to the architect's eye. And really what it revealed is different sensory sensibilities according to the job that you do. Also, we created an image archive of the project, and very limited research has really looked at how particular atmospheres are conjured through images and how power relations are embedded in them. So what we looked at were thousands, hundreds of these images. Each street has around 1,000 images, yeah, for it. And then one gets selected for a committee or to be sold on a marketing page. So we created this stock of images and really tried to analyze the aesthetic impact of the images. And we looked at basically how they construct these atmospheres through computer technology. And this method helped us to understand how atmospheres gradually constructed and build up. In other words, how visual aspects of experience are important in shaping atmosphere, but only in combination with this range of other senses, subjective and narrative elements. So the text that goes with it is also very important to evoke certain sensory stimulations. Lastly, we interviewed a lot of the architects, visualizers in this project, and what was interesting is we often forget the value also of talk when researching the sensory. And as Mason and Davis point out, people are very good at expressing their sensory affinities verbally. So let's not forget the classic interviews and the quality and evocative nature of verbal descriptions. However, the interesting thing is, despite the power of architects, of planners, designers to produce sensory predispositions through their manipulation of the material landscape, atmospheres are not stable, thank God, and get constantly challenged, subverted, and ignored by subjects through temporal dimensions, as I will show now. So before the architect project, we did another project in less glamorous places in Qatar or Barcelona, in Milton Keynes and Bedford here in Britain. And there we were really interested in how users experience highly stylized urban environments. And the research was informed by Lee's critique of an emphasis on the political semiotics of the built environment that favor the meanings inscribed by the production of the urban landscape, but don't focus on the consumption of the urban landscape. So our research on Bedford's High Street and Milton Keynes shopping mall revealed that urban experience is not a direct effect of the design of the built environment, but that experience, sensory experience, is very much a mediated, has a mediated nature to it. So what we found out is that sensory experience is mediated firstly by bodily mobility. So what practice are you engaged in while you're walking through a mall or a high street? And that directs your senses. So if you are, if it's task-oriented shopping, you ignore huge swathes of information. You ignore the music and you're looking for what you're looking for, yeah, presents or whatever you want to get. And you ignore very much. So there's a coming forward of certain sensory experience and not going backwards, but neglect of other sensory experiences. And that's informed by the practices we're involved in when we are in our urban environment. But also we found out that sensory experiences are intertwined. Actually, I'll show you one more there. Yeah. Hanging out, a teenager, that's her vision. These are her pictures of the shopping mall in Milton Keynes. And I think it really reflects the sensory experience, of a more teenage mind and practice of what's important to her, what she thought was funny, and so on. Also, we found out that sensory experiences are intertwined with what Seremetakis calls perceptual memories. So I'll talk about that in a second. Basically, we did a survey, classical survey with 4 questions to about 500 people on each high street, and asked them 4 very basic questions, but also a description of each place. And like I mentioned before when I talked, is everybody compared, or a lot of people, more than 50% of people compared the high street to another place in the world. From LA over to Barcelona, all these places were related somehow to Milton Keynes. The other thing we did also was the classical walk-along method with photo elicitations, where participants took photos and of things that struck them, like this teenager, and we would then sit down with them and discuss what these images meant to them. And what really that allowed us to do is that that we gave the sensing back to the interviewees. It wasn't us directing the interviews, but they very much directed their personal experience through the pictures. So what I've shown so far as the urban sensorium and the construction of atmospheres is a highly fluctuating and unstable phenomenon, and therefore needs to be analyzed from a range of sensory methods, sensory perspectives, and thought, and methodologies. And there's one more aspect I want to briefly talk about, which I've just started thinking about in more depth, and that's the importance of the temporal of time in sensory experience. So, as I mentioned in my introduction, the sensory atmospheric realm of the street is culturally and historically contingent, meaning that it's not permanent, but in constant fluctuation and transformation. And a range of studies have shown that, of course, thinking here of Sennett, Flesh and Stone, how the senses and how we structure a city keep changing. But as Mumford has also pointed out that the city transcends time and unites past and present. So the making of urban space of the street is in many ways a materialization of the passing of time, reflecting and reifying the regimes of power and social dynamics at any time in the built environment. And then we have also the users of the city with their diverse temporalities. And all these different temporalities of the physical, of the human, of the non-human seem to collide in the experience of place. How much have I got? 2 minutes? Okay. Right. So, I had a few more thoughts on time, but what I want to briefly talk about is a network I've set up with Astrid Svensson, who is a historian at Brunel University. We've got a steering group with a diversity of academics and museum curators who's looking basically at how we can make sense of time, senses, and space in the city. How can we research them? And the thing I wanted to point out, and you're very welcome to look at the website, is that basically I think that to understand the city nowadays, we need to have this kind of interdisciplinary approach. But also urban professionals, academics, there needs to be an interprofessional approach to the senses. And as academics, we very quickly think of the corporate world as the enemies. And I think, while there might be something in it, not the enemies, but basically we need to think together of how we can learn from each other's methods, and that maybe academics can learn something from urban branding, from planning consultations, from artists, and so on. And I'm bringing all these people together in 3 cities in Europe, Barcelona, London, and Cologne, to talk and discuss how we can innovate methods by mixing up what we've got from the different professions. So to finish then, did I go out of this? Yeah. I want to point out 2 things, and I've got a range of questions that I thought would be quite interesting to look at. But I've been very influenced by Les Bach's and Nirmal Purva's latest book on creative lift methods, actually lift methods. And they talk about expanding our methodological imagination and to reimagine more traditional methods as well as probe new tools and devices to generate new forms of data. And I think we need to develop new forms of identityness, basically, that can admit to the fleeting, the distributed, the multiple, the sensory, the kinesthetic aspects of social life, because that's what makes a street alive. And I think, methods have to now follow up on this new trend on the sensory turn. And I'll finish with that.